Okay, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay.
All right, guys. Take two.
Here we go.
For those of you that didn't know, we had to take a take two.
Sometimes we have take fives.
Sometimes we have to take 17.
Yeah, we do. All right, guys. It's true crime time again. We hope you've all had a great week so far. And if not, we hope that this brings you a little dark joy. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Taylor. And this is
Pure Malice.
If you're listening on Spotify, go ahead and tap that follow button for us. It really helps us out. And with that, let's get into the fifth and final part of the Lake Waco murders.
Let's do it. So in episode 4, we left you with the Lake Waco appeals finally moving into the spotlight, while Jan Price's investigation into Juanita White's murder started connecting back to David Spence's case. Munir Deeb's conviction was overturned, and when his case went back to trial, the evidence that once helped send him to death row completely fell apart, ending with his acquittal. Meanwhile, David's appeals were stacked with serious questions. Recanted informant testimony, claims that witnesses had been fed information, Brady violation issues, disputed bite mark evidence, and even law enforcement officials who no longer believed the case had been handled right. And despite all of that, the courts refused to grant him a new trial. So on April 3rd, 1997, David Spence was executed, still maintaining his innocence in his final words. And even then, after David was executed, this case still wasn't over, because investigative journalist Fred Danon kept digging, chasing the remaining evidence and the unanswered questions still haunting the Lake Waco murders.
So, Danon reached out to Jill's aunt, Jan. That's a tongue twister.
It is.
So, Danon reached out to Jill's aunt, Jan, and she agrees to help. According to Cindy V. Culp, writing for the Waco Tribune-Herald, in a piece later published through TexasBar.com, some evidence had already been tested by this point. Beer cans found near the crime scene had been tested and did not produce anything useful. Hairs found on the victims' bodies had also been tested, but those results did not lead anywhere major either. But there were still other pieces of evidence that had either never been tested in a meaningful way or had not been tested with the kind of technology that could possibly tell them something more. And those are the pieces Danon was interested in. Things like the shoelaces and the torn terry cloth strips used to bind the victims, because if the people who committed these murders handled those items, then maybe, just maybe, there was something more on them.
Mm-hmm.
So those items are eventually sent to a California lab called Forensic Science Associates, which was run by Edward Blake, a DNA expert whose work had been involved in other exoneration cases. But unfortunately, the testing available at that time doesn't give them the breakthrough they're hoping for. The terry cloth strips reportedly had a lot of biological material on them, but because they were soaked in the victim's blood, isolating a perpetrator's DNA profile was extremely difficult with the methods available then. And when Blake's lab tried to extract a sample from the shoelaces, they weren't able to get anything useful. So once again, they're left waiting. Not because the evidence is meaningless, but because the technology is not quite there yet. And nobody forgets about it. This is not one of those things that gets tested once, fails, and then everybody just walks away. The evidence is still sitting there along with the questions. And years later, when YSTR testing becomes a more realistic option, Danon and Reeves want the shoelaces tested again, because that type of testing looks specifically at male DNA through the Y chromosome. In a case involving male suspects and male DNA potentially left behind, that could make all the difference.
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal.
Mm-hmm.
But then the whole thing gets even messier. By that point, Blake's lab is not accredited, and an attorney involved with the University of Texas Innocence Project suggests moving the testing to an accredited lab, which sounds reasonable, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're dealing with crime scene evidence in a triple murder case, and especially a case where one man has already been executed, possibly wrongfully so, you want the testing handled in the cleanest, most defensible way possible. But according to Culp's reporting, Blake's lab declined to send the shoelaces elsewhere, claiming work product, meaning that they were treating them as a part of their litigation-related testing files rather than evidence that should simply be released to another lab, which is crazy to think about.
How do you get, it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, but that's exactly what made it so frustrating, because this was not just paperwork. These were physical items from a triple murder case, and newer testing might have been able to answer questions the original testing could not. Evidence that could potentially speak to whether the right men were convicted and whether David Spence was executed for a crime he did not commit. So the question becomes, how does a lab get to hold on to evidence like that when the whole point is supposed to be finding the truth? During 2001, Jan arranged for Danon to come meet with Jill's family and explain what he had been doing, what he had found, and the problems he had been running into with the evidence that still had not been fully tested. Because up until that point, it had really just been Danon and Jan pushing this forward. But once he sat down with Jill's family and walked them through the issues, the meeting shook a lot of them to their core. Many of them had believed for years that justice had already been served. So hearing all of these problems laid out together, the informants, the bite mark evidence, the recantations, the questions around the investigation, and now the evidence that still might hold answers, left them rattled. And understandably, they wanted answers. So Danon started working with one of David Spence's attorneys, Walter Reeves, who we had not really talked about yet, but who had come into the case at some point along the way. Together, they started trying to get the evidence moved out of Blake's lab and into an accredited lab where newer testing could be done. And eventually, in 2012, they were successful. The evidence is moved to Arkansas Genomics in Little Rock. So after years of waiting, fighting, and pushing, it finally looks like the testing might happen in a way that could actually give people something solid.
But then Danon basically drops off the grid altogether. But according to the podcast Crime Junkie, Jill's family told them they didn't know how to get back in touch with Fred Danon. And they also did not know what needed to happen next if they wanted to locate or access any evidence that might still be able to provide answers. So at this point, the family was left in this terrible position of knowing the evidence had once been moved for testing, but not knowing where it was now, or who had it, or whether anything could still be done with it. So Crime Junkie, they started trying to track down the evidence. According to their reporting, they looked into Arkansas Genomics, but discovered the company had shut down. They said someone their team spoke with at the Arkansas Secretary of State's office told them Arkansas Genomics had not filed annual reports or paid fees since 2014.
Wow.
Which was only about 2 years after the evidence was reportedly sent there. They also contacted the company's registered agent, who said she did not know what happened to the evidence. She told them she passed a message along to the former owner, who was also her ex-husband, but Crime Junkie said they never heard back from him. But through their own digging, Crime Junkie was eventually able to find Danon and reported that they sent a message through his itinerary agent. And a few hours later, he called one of their reporters on WhatsApp from his home in Mexico.
That is so crazy. Kudos to them.
So according to Crime Junkie, Danon told them that the evidence had been transferred to another lab, but he would not say which one. He also told them he was still haunted by the case and had recently started looking into it again. So that matters because for Jill's family, this was not just about curiosity. This was about connections. It was about finally having some kind of path back to the evidence, back to the questions, and back to the person who may know where things stand now. So Crime Junkie made it clear that they were trying to help reconnect Danon and Jill's family because the family deserves to know whether it's safe, whether it can still be tested, and whether there is any real chance of moving forward.
According to Crime Junkie, Jill's family was relieved to at least have that connection point again. But decades after Jill's murder, her family is still trying to piece together what happened, still trying to understand what evidence remains, and still living with the reality that people they trusted to get justice for Jill left them with questions that have never fully been answered.
Sad.
Heartbreaking to live with, you know? Mm-hmm. I want to talk about a few details that may not be as widely known, but still feel important whenever you look at the bigger picture. And one of those details is the truck. If you remember, Carlton Stowers is the author of Careless Whispers, the book about this case. According to reporting by Bob Herbert in the New York Times, Stowers had purchased a truck sometime after David Spence's second trial. And this was not just any random truck. It had reportedly belonged to Gilbert Melendez, and at one point, based on Gilbert and Tony's testimony at the time, it was believed to have been the vehicle used to transport the bodies to the park where they were found. Mm-hmm. Now, from what I understand, there was evidence showing that the truck may have been miles away being repaired that night, possibly completely out of commission. So even that part gets messy. But still, Stowers buys the truck. And then later, he gives it to Truman Simons. Which, I'm sorry, but that is so strange.
That's weird.
What exactly is that? Is it a gift, a trophy, a piece of the case? Evidence? Not evidence? Just some weird souvenir from one of the most disturbing murder cases in Waco's history? Who knows? Apparently, this truck sits on Simon's property for years. Then, right around the time DNA testing starts becoming more widely used in forensic investigations, suddenly the truck is sold to a junk dealer and crushed.
Why?
It's a great question. And I'm not saying that proves anything, but I am saying the timing is hard to ignore. Because in a case where the wrong people may have been convicted and where questions have followed almost every major piece of the story, watching a vehicle tied to the state's original theory get destroyed feels like one more detail that just won't stay quiet.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, Simons is not here to answer those questions anymore. He died the night of October 30th in 2021 in Waco, Texas at the age of 78. That's young.
Is it young?
Well, I worked in hospice forever and I work in a hospital. So for me, I'm like, that's pretty young. I mean, think about it. Mimi's what, like 83, 84?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. But I mean, I guess Dad's parents both died young.
I don't know, and I say that, and I always feel like old is like upper 80s to 90s. So, whatever explanation he would have given for keeping that truck, for letting it sit there for years, and for what happened to it afterward, we don't have that from him. And then, of course, there's the question that has been sitting underneath all of this from the beginning. If it wasn't Menier, David, Gilbert, and Tony, then who was it? Well, that's where we're heading to next.
Sure is.
And this is my opinion, but I think some early theories were treated more like inconveniences than possibilities. I'm not saying I know who did it. Obviously, I don't. But I do think that there were early leads that should have been chased harder.
Absolutely.
And one of those names was Terry Lee Harper, also known as Tab.
Mr. Not-So-Gangsta.
Our official gangster Tab. According to reporting by Alan Berlow in Salon, police later uncovered that Waco citizens who were at the lake that night had identified other possible suspects, including Harper. So Berlow reported that Harper had allegedly boasted about being involved in the murders and that 7 witnesses said he had talked about his involvement. Even more troubling, 3 of those witnesses reportedly said they heard Harper make those claims before the murders had been publicly reported on the radio. And Harper was not just some random name floating around in a rumor mill. Berlow reported that Harper had a rap sheet listing 25 assaults, including several against teenagers at Lake Waco.
That is crazy.
He also described in later case coverage as someone connected to Kenneth with the drug world. When Spence's lawyer eventually questioned him, Harper denied involvement and signed an affidavit saying he was home watching Dynasty at the time of the murders. Wonder if he was watching Duck Dynasty or the other one.
Probably the other one.
Anyway, shut up.
Hey.
I love me some Duck Dynasty.
Kat loves that show too. She'll watch it on repeat and repeat.
It was hilarious. All right, well, but according to Berlow's reporting, Dynasty did not air that night. So again, I'm not saying Terry Lee Harper committed the Lake Waco murders, but I am saying this was a lead that at the very least deserved a lot more sunlight than it got.
Mm-hmm.
And then Harper's story ends in another violent turn. Because in 1994, when the police went to arrest him in connection with another crime, the fatal stabbing of an elderly man, Harper died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound from a shotgun.
A shotgun. Oh, man.
Mm-hmm. But I do think names like Terry Lee Harper show exactly why this case still feels so unresolved. Because there were alternate theories and details that make you wonder why certain doors were closed so quickly and why others were forced open until they fit the story somebody wanted to tell.
Mm-hmm. It really does.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are two other names I can't help but wonder about. Now, again, we're not saying that these men committed the Lake Waco murders. We're saying that David's defense team wanted to present them as alternate suspects at his first trial, and the jury never got to hear that full picture.
Mm-hmm.
One of those men was Ronnie Bryden. According to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, Ronnie's stepmother, Catherine Bryden, testified outside the presence of the jury that Ronnie came to her house shortly before 6:30 in the morning on July 14th, 1982, the morning after the murders. She said he showed up wanting to use her washer and dryer, and he threw a t-shirt, blue jean, and tennis shoes into the washing machine while she was already doing laundry. She also testified that Ronnie told her he had been drinking and fishing at Lake Waco the night before, and that he asked to borrow his father's knife because he had lost his own. But the next day, after speaking with an attorney, Catherine recanted the testimony and said it was all a lie. So again, what does that mean? We honestly don't know, but I do think it's the kind of thing that makes you ask, what if? Because the original testimony, before it was recanted, painted Ronnie in a very strange light, and there were other pieces the defense tried to bring awareness to as well. According to the same court opinion, the defense also pro-offered testimony linking Ronnie to the convenience store where Jill Montgomery had cashed a $200 check before she was murdered. Ronnie's wife, Joyce Bryden, was reportedly working there that day and knew Jill had received the cash. And I know that for some people, 1982 doesn't seem that long ago, and for others, it feels like an eternity. So I just wanted to kind of throw this out there for comparison. So $200 in 1982 is equivalent to about $690 today.
Which to me, I'm like, that's still not that much. And like, if you think about it, but like back then, $200 would go a lot further than what $690 today would.
Absolutely, it would, but it was not worth a life. Three lives, you know?
No.
It's crazy.
No,
not that you were saying. Yeah, sorry.
I'm not saying that at all.
I didn't mean to insinuate that.
Thanks
My
for
bad.
putting words in my mouth.
I'm sorry.
Next time I'll just say, bah.
Bah.
Stupid.
I have to do it. Bust out with a ring of bah. Okay, anyways.
$690 today is pretty insignificant.
It is.
I mean, really, I think a lot of money is insignificant for a life.
Yeah,
whatever.
there's no amount of money that justifies it, but... So the defense also presented evidence that Ronnie was in serious financial trouble during the summer of 1982. The court ultimately said that evidence may have suggested motive, but didn't sufficiently link Ronnie to the murders. Ronnie Bryden himself was later murdered. A grave record lists his death as May 22nd, 1992.
So close to my birthday.
Right before you came.
Yep.
And a later Texas appeal opinion also refers to him as having been murdered years after the Lake Waco case. I found one secondary source claiming he was shot several times in Waco, but I have not been able to independently verify that through a primary source yet. So with that, I'm going to say take it with a grain of salt and do your own research. The other name was James Bishop. According to the court opinion, David's defense also tried to connect Ronnie Brighton to Bishop, who had lived in Waco in 1982 before moving from Texas to California. And
I don't think I'd move to California.
I wanted to go to school in California, and Dad was like, "You're not going to California. You'll never come home."
You loved Cal State or something.
Yeah, Berkeley, Cal.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was my favorite school. All right. Before moving from Texas to California in August of 1982. While Bishop was in California, he committed a horrifying and brutal sexual assault and attempted double murder of 2 teenage girls on the beach that the court described as very similar to the murders of Kenneth Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Rice. The attack happened on February 21st, 1983, when Bishop kidnapped 2 teenage girls at gunpoint, took them to a secluded beach in San Diego, sexually assaulted them, shot both girls multiple times, and left them for dead. But miraculously, both victims survived. Bishop later pleaded guilty to crimes including attempted murder, rape, and forcible oral copulation. And in 1984, he was sentenced to 79 years in prison.
Well, good. Rot.
Right? Yes. That sentence was later affirmed by the California Court of Appeal.
But the jury didn't hear this alternate suspect theory because the judge excluded it before trial. The court found that once Catherine Brighton recanted her testimony, the remaining evidence did not sufficiently connect Ronnie or Bishop to the Lake Waco murders. And legally, that may be how the court saw it, but narratively, when you step back and look at the whole case, it still matters because tunnel vision is dangerous when people's lives are involved. And when being right becomes more important than finding the truth, the wrong doors can stay closed while the wrong people get pushed through the ones that are left open. And that is basically the argument David Spence's family would still be making decades later. So, on April 19th, 2017, 20 years after David was executed, his sons filed a lawsuit in Travis County against the state of Texas. They filed it individually and as heirs and representatives of David's estate. And the estate of Anthony Melendez was part of the lawsuit too. So this was not just David's family saying, "We think our father is innocent." It was also Tony's estate stepping forward and saying, "This didn't happen the way the state said it did." So the lawsuit was filed in the 345th Judicial District Court of Travis County as an original petition for a declaratory judgment and a request for disclosure. And they didn't soften what they believed happened. So Courthouse News summarized it pretty plainly. David's sons claimed that Texas bribed witnesses, coerced confessions, and used junk science to build the case against their father. And what makes this lawsuit important is that it pulls together so many of the threads we have spent this entire series untangling, or at least trying to. The jailhouse informants, the bite mark evidence, the Melendez brothers' statements, the alternate suspect leads that never made it to the jury, the hidden evidence, the law enforcement officers who later said that they had their doubts, the problems in Juanita White's murder case, all of it gets laid out as one larger argument. That the state's version of the Lake Waco murders was not just flawed, but built on evidence that should never have been trusted the way it was.
And when you hear all of that again, I mean, I know we went over it, but man.
It's a lot.
It is. One of the biggest pieces centered on Tony and Gilbert Melendez. According to the lawsuit, the Melendez brothers' confessions were not clean, voluntary confessions from 2 men finally telling the truth. The lawsuit claimed their statements were coerced, shaped, and used to support a story the state already wanted to tell. Courthouse News reported that the lawsuit called it a conspiracy involving the Melendez brothers' court-appointed attorneys, District Attorney Vic Bissell, and Truman Simons. According to the complaint, Anthony Melendez later claimed his confession and trial testimony were scripted by Simons and coerced by the state and his own attorneys, who allegedly warned him that if he fought the charges, he would end up in the death chamber right alongside David Spence. And the lawsuit goes even further than that. It claimed that Tony had an ironclad alibi, placing him hundreds of miles away from Waco at the time of the murders. It also alleged that conversations recorded in Fizell's office were later subpoenaed during the federal corruption investigation into Fizell, and that one of those recordings showed the district attorney had virtually no case against Melendez. According to the petition, other recordings painted what it called a disturbing picture of collusion between the district attorney and the Melendez brothers' court-appointed defense attorneys. The lawsuit alleged those tapes showed that the DA and the defense attorneys knew Tony had an alibi and that Tony had been promised release in roughly 10 years if he pled guilty.
That's still a lot to do for nothing.
Yeah, 100%. And just sit with that for a second, because if those allegations are true, then this is not just a case of someone getting it wrong. That is a completely different animal. That is the people who are supposed to stand on opposite sides of a courtroom allegedly working from the same script while a man is staring down the possibility of death. That is crazy. Again, those are allegations from the lawsuit, not findings from a full trial on the merits. But they are serious enough that they cannot be brushed off like background noise. The lawsuit also brought the focus back to the informants. And by this point, that part of the case had already started to look deeply unstable. Several jailhouse witnesses had recanted or claimed that they were fed information. Critics of the case, including retired Waco Police Lieutenant Marvin Horton, later said Simons gave jailhouse witnesses favors and fed them information. Horton remained convinced innocent men had been charged in the Lake Waco case.
And that matters because the state's case depended heavily on those voices, not physical evidence tying David to the crime scene, not DNA, not a weapon recovered from him. The case was held together by stories. Stories from informants, stories from cooperating co-defendants, stories that over time started bending, breaking, or walking themselves back. So by the time this lawsuit is filed, the question is how many of these witnesses were given the same information and then treated like independent proof. Then there is the bite mark evidence. The lawsuit accused the state of relying on junk science. And in this case, that obviously points straight back to Homer Campbell's bite mark testimony. Because for years, that evidence carried weight. It sounded scientific. And it sounded like the thing that could make a jury believe there was something more than informant testimony holding this case together. But later expert review made that evidence look much shakier. And once the bite mark testimony started to crumble, one of the last pieces still holding up the state's version starts to look less like science and more like another reason this case should have been questioned a long time ago. The lawsuit also pointed back to early investigative. The lawsuit also pointed back to early investigative leads that did not fit the state's final story. According to the petition, Detective Raymond Salinas had developed a theory that the murders could have been connected to a drug transaction gone wrong, and that Terry Lee Harper, aka Tab, was part of that early direction. Once again, why pick Tab? Worst name ever. Sorry.
Truly. Especially for a street guy, it just doesn't, I don't know.
The petition described Harper as a violent felon who had allegedly dealt drugs to Kenneth Franks and said Harper was the only suspect arrested and read his rights while Salinas was leading the investigation. But Salinas did not have enough to get an indictment, and eventually the path lost momentum. Then, according to the petition, after Salinas suspended the investigation in September of 1982, Truman Simons learned the case had gone inactive and called Chief Larry Scott at home. The lawsuit claimed Simons told Scott he wanted to take over the investigation and said he was going to solve the case in a week. And knowing where the case eventually goes, that line does not feel like confidence. It feels like a warning.
Because what happens next is exactly what we've been talking about. The original drug-related theory gets left behind, other names and other leads fade into the background, and the story starts moving towards David Spence, Munir Deeb, and the Melendez brothers. And once that version takes hold, it does not just become a theory. It becomes the version of events that sends one man to the execution chamber and leaves others carrying convictions for the rest of their lives. The lawsuit also tied in concerns from people inside or close to law enforcement. The petition alleged that Simons had critics inside law enforcement, including Chief Scott. And years later, reporting from KWTX showed that Horton, Russ Hunt, and Walter Rivas all believed the Lake Waco defendants had been wrongfully convicted.
KWTX, Texas.
Yeah. Should have been news later. Russ Hunt said, "I believe that David Spence was an innocent person who was murdered at the hands of the state." But to be fair, Feazell has continued to defend the prosecutions. KWTX reported that both Feazell and Simons defended the investigation and the jury verdicts for years. Feazell said he had never doubted that his office prosecuted the right men, and he pointed to the fact that the convictions were upheld in court. So even all these years later, you still have two completely different versions of this case fighting for oxygen. One says justice was done, the other says that the system got it wrong and then protected itself. And then there's Juanita White's case, which sits like a shadow over all of this. Because Calvin Washington and Joe Sidney Williams were convicted in Juanita's murder, and Detective Jan Price had raised serious concerns about that case almost from the beginning. Years later, DNA proved Benny Carroll was responsible for Juanita's murder. Joe's conviction was overturned, and Calvin Washington was eventually pardoned. So when the lawsuit points to problems in cases developed by Simons, Juanita's case is not some random side note. It's a very real example of what can happen when the wrong theory gets protected too long.
So the lawsuit is basically saying, ask yourself if any rational jury would have convicted these men if they had known what we know now. And for a moment, maybe it feels like this could finally be the reckoning. Not for David, because David is already gone. Not for Gilbert or Tony in any meaningful way. But maybe, at the very least, it could be a public record, a legal acknowledgement, some kind of official recognition that this case was not what the state said it was. But again, that's not what happens. The state of Texas moves to dismiss the lawsuit, and the case gets thrown into a different kind of fight. The fight becomes about whether the court even had the power to give David's sons and Tony's estate what they were asking for. The appeals court does not hold a trial and decide that David was guilty. It didn't hold a trial and decide David was innocent. It didn't weigh every crack in the case. Instead, what it says is that the civil court does not have jurisdiction to give that kind of relief because of sovereign immunity and the way Texas's wrongful imprisonment compensation law works. And in 2019, the Texas Third Court of Appeals affirmed the dismissal. Frustrating.
It is. It really is. And that part is important. Under Texas law, wrongful imprisonment compensation is not just something a family can sue for because they believe the conviction was wrong. The law requires a specific kind of innocence determination first, which obviously they have to have that boundary.
Yeah.
But the person generally has to receive a full pardon based on innocence or habeas relief based on a court finding of actual innocence, or a dismissal tied to a prosecutor saying there is no credible evidence and that the person is actually innocent. And if the person is deceased, their heirs or estate can only recover if that person would have been entitled to compensation under those same standards. So the court's reasoning is basically, before compensation can happen, there has to be a qualifying innocence finding through the process Texas law recognizes. And David and Tony did not have that. So even though the lawsuit was trying to use a civil court to get a declaration of innocence, of independence, okay.
4th of July.
It was just 4th of July. To use a civil court to get a declaration of innocence, the appeal court said that was not the legal door available to them. The court also said sovereign immunity barred the claims against the state. In plain English, sovereign immunity means you cannot sue the state unless the state has clearly allowed itself to be sued in that particular kind of case. And here, the appeal court found that the plaintiffs had not shown a waiver that would allow their claims to go forward. So the dismissal stands. Then, in August of 2019, the Texas Supreme Court denied review, which left the appeal court's dismissal in place. And just like that, the lawsuit ends at the threshold. And that is one of the most frustrating things about this case, because over and over, it feels like people are pointing at the same burning building saying, hey, something is wrong here. But every time they try to get someone with the full power to put it out, they are told that they're using the wrong door to access it.
So, the lawsuit did not officially undo the convictions or force the state of Texas to compensate David's family or Tony's estate, but it did put the argument in one place, in court filings. Factually, morally, and honestly, there are still too many things that do not feel settled. There are so many questions and cracks throughout the original story, but proving that through the legal doors the system allows, that has proven to be the most difficult thing of all. And because this case brings up so many issues surrounding wrongful convictions, unreliable testimony, hidden evidence, and the people left fighting after the courts say a case is over, we wanted to take a second to highlight the Innocence Project of Texas. The Innocence Project of Texas works to free people who have been wrongfully convicted, reform the policies that allow wrongful convictions to happen, and educate the public about the reality of these cases. They also provide free investigative and legal services to people incarcerated in Texas for crimes they did not commit. So if you're looking for a way to support work connected to the issues we talked about in this case, you can learn more about the work they're doing or donate at innocencetexas.org.
And while we're talking about cases that leave people searching for answers, we also want to highlight a missing persons case. This week, we want to share the case of Justin Weldon O'Brien. Justin was 23 years old when he was last seen in Waco, Texas on April 29th of 2002. Texas DPS lists his case as endangered with foul play possible and says his vehicle was later found abandoned in Dallas. Justin has a tribal-style armband tattoo on his right arm and his last name O'Brien tattooed across his back. If you know anything about Justin's disappearance, please contact the Texas Missing Persons Clearinghouse at 512-424-5074 or 1-800-346-3243. Because even after all this time, one detail could still matter.
And that is where we're going to leave you.
I'm Ryan.
And I'm Taylor. And remember, it's not just crime. And remember, it's not just crime. It's pure malice.
Join us next week for another deep dive. And if you are listening on Spotify, go ahead and tap that follow button for us. It really helps our show and it keeps you in the loop with our new episodes. So hit the follow button and we will see you next week. Bye, guys.